I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to this week's episode. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you about the events that Lurk will be attending this summer and fall. First is the Sasquatch Saturday, celebrating the Sykesville Monster on June 24th at Piney Run Park in Sykesville, Maryland. Then on August 26th, we have the Bigfoot and Paranormal Expo in Reynoldsville, Pennsylvania. And on September 30th, we have the Whitehall, New York Sasquatch Festival and Calling Contest. It'll be the third year that I have attended the Whitehall, New York Festival. It is a lot of fun. So if you guys are going to be in the area for one or all of these, make sure you stop by our booth and say hello, check out the merch, chat for a minute. But let's get to this week's episode. This week we're going to be looking at some haunted lighthouses, specifically ones located in California. So we already looked at the haunted Point Lookout Lighthouse in Maryland as part of the Haunted Point Lookout episode. And we've spent some time recently in Michigan, so I thought it was time we headed to the West Coast. I've traveled out to California several years ago, specifically to the San Francisco and Monterey Bay areas. While in Monterey, I visited a lighthouse in the area. It turns out that the lighthouse is haunted. Unfortunately, I wasn't prepared with my ghost hunting equipment, and I didn't have any weird experiences. I wasn't really there very long. The lighthouse that I'm talking about is the Point Pinos Lighthouse on the Monterey Bay in Pacific Grove, California. The Point Pinos Lighthouse was first lit on February 1st, 1855. It is the oldest continuously operating lighthouse on the west coast of the United States and still has its original lens. The lighthouse is still an active United States Coast Guard aid to navigation. The lighthouse is now on the Register of Historic Places and is open for tours on Saturdays and Sundays. Since its completion in 1855, the lighthouse has seen many upgrades, from running on whale oil to lard, then kerosene, and then eventually electricity. Its location on the mainland, only a short distance from Monterey, meant that the keepers weren't subjected to the typical solitary lightkeeper's life. One of the best-known keepers at Point Pinos was Emily Fish, who served between 1893 and 1914. She lived in and maintained the Point Pinos Lighthouse. She loved living at the lighthouse. She built up the well-maintained gardens that still surround the lighthouse today, and she also used the space to throw parties for the locals. That's how she became known as the socialite keeper. Emily Fish didn't die in the lighthouse, but she's said to be haunting it. Because she loved the place so much and had such a strong connection to it, it seems she felt the need to return to the lighthouse after her death. Visitors to the lighthouse claim to have seen Emily's ghost most often inside her former living quarters. Her bedroom is one of the most active areas of the lighthouse. Many people have reported smelling Emily's perfume and hear the sounds of someone walking past them wearing a flowing skirt. The first lightkeeper was Charles Layton, and he was helping a local posse pursue the notorious bandit Anastasio Garcia in 1856. While on the posse, he was shot in the stomach and died from his wounds a few days later. Though dead, Charles Layton still wanders through the lighthouse, carrying out his lightkeeper duties. There are several different unexplained phenomena that are attributed to Charles Layton. Items go missing or get misplaced, and doors open and close on their own. If you're lucky, you may see Charles Layton wandering around the lighthouse, trimming the wick or polishing the windows. Across the street from the lighthouse is Carmelo Cemetery, and it's possible it may contribute to the lighthouse hauntings. There is another female ghost seen in the lighthouse. The ghost is that of a young teenage female that has haunted the building since her death of tuberculosis in the early 1900s. Some people have also claimed to have seen movement out of the corner of their eye on the cemetery grounds. There's one more ghost that has been associated with the lighthouse, and this one is a little more famous. Scottish author Robert Louis Stevenson, you might know some of his works like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Kidnapped, or A Child's Garden of Verses, or, possibly, Treasure Island. Stevenson traveled to Monterey, California, searching for the woman he loved. She was married, and he did not find her in Monterey. Robert Louis Stevenson was basically destitute when he arrived in Monterey, and could barely afford his room at a boarding house. He worked odd jobs to make money while he stayed in Monterey and wrote a story about pirates. He also spent a lot of time walking to the Point Pinos lighthouse. He came from a family of lighthouse engineers, so he was at home at the lighthouse. Eventually, Stevenson found his love in San Francisco, and she was newly divorced. The couple married and lived happily in Samoa until his death in 1894. Though Stevenson died and was buried in Samoa, his ghost is often seen walking around the lighthouse grounds. Now we're going to head north to the Pigeon Point Lighthouse in Pescadero, California. The Pigeon Point Lighthouse was built in 1871 and first lighted on November 25, 1872. Like the Point Pinos light, Pigeon Point Lighthouse is still an active Coast Guard navigational aid. The lighthouse stands at 115 feet and resembles the typical New England type lighthouse. The lighthouse and the land surrounding it are preserved as the Pigeon Point Light Station State Historic Park. The lighthouse is also listed on the National Register of Historic Places and designated as a California Historical Landmark. The area of Pigeon Point was avoided by mariners traveling along the California coast and was nameless for many years, until tragedy struck. In 1853, a Yankee clipper named the Carrier Pigeon encountered thick fog, and the captain thought he was near the San Francisco Bay and ended up wrecking the ship on the rocks. Luckily, though, no one died, but from that day forward the area was known as Pigeon Point. The land where the lighthouse is located was purchased from a man named Loren Coburn. Coburn had quite the reputation. He was known to sue everyone. He sued farmers and ranchers over water rights, sued craftsmen over the quality of their work, sued county tax assessors over the assessment of his property, and allegedly even sued a neighbor because their kids took some strawberries from his field. He ended up amassing a huge fortune, being described as a millionaire in the early 1900s. He died in 1919 with basically no friends other than his wife, Sarah. After her husband's death, Sarah Coburn did her best to continue running the various business interests, some of which Loren Coburn acquired through legal means. But Sarah herself apparently made some enemies. In the same year, 1919, Sarah Coburn was found beaten to death in her home in Pescadero, California. On June 4, 1919, Sarah Coburn was found dead in her bed. She had been beaten to death. Her head was crushed and her body mangled. The walls were drenched in blood, and a bloody 2x4 was found next to the bed. When the neighbors entered the house and discovered her body, they also found what the newspapers at the time referred to as the demented nephew of the deceased. So this gets slightly weird. Loren Coburn had a son from a previous marriage. he was married to Sarah's sister. So his son Wallace was Sarah's nephew and her stepson. The son was 60 years old at the time of Sarah's death, and he had been declared mentally incompetent. Basically, he was what we would call now mentally handicapped. Everyone, of course, felt Wallace had killed her, but later Sarah's own attorney stated he didn't think Wallace was capable of it. Another interesting point is that there were court battles for Lauren Coburn's money prior to her death, and her death made someone else very rich. No one was ever charged with the murder. And while that story is tragic and creepy on its own, it's not the end of the story. Needless to say, the local sheriff's department vigorously looked into the case and had an autopsy done. The autopsy was conducted in a local doctor's office. Mrs. Coburn's organs were removed and preserved in formaldehyde. The sheriff was particularly interested in her stomach contents. But before the stomach could be looked at, it was either lost or stolen. Sarah Coburn was buried next to her husband with all of her organs except her stomach. Today, people claim to see Sarah's ghost roaming the grounds of the Pigeon Point Lighthouse. They've also seen her staring out of the windows of the tower. The park rangers say she's there either looking for someone to sue or searching for her stomach. Which is probably the first time I've ever heard of a ghost looking for something other than their head. Next up is the St. George Reef Light, located 6 miles off the coast of Northern California, near Crescent City. The lighthouse was first lit on October 20th, 1892, and stands 144 feet above the water. The light is currently inactive. It was apparently abandoned because it was not very useful. The light was not always visible through the fog. One of the stories from St. George Reef comes from a time before the lighthouse was even built. July of 1865, the side-wheeler Brother Jonathan was headed to Vancouver, British Columbia from San Francisco. She made this trip many times and was very fast and able to complete the journey in 3 days. But on this trip, the Brother Jonathan sailed right into a heavy storm. Lost in the storm, the captain sailed the Brother Jonathan straight into St. George Reef. The collision with the reef tore a hole in the hull of the ship within minutes. Despite valiant efforts made by the crew, nearly 200 people perished. Only 19 were able to reach the shore in a lifeboat. Among the dead was Union General Wright, one of President Lincoln's closest friends, and a famous San Francisco madam and 7 of her girls. It's said that the ghosts of General Wright, the madam, and her girls are all seen standing on the edge of the reef, possibly looking for someone to rescue them. It was the wreck of the Brother Jonathan that brought about the building of the lighthouse. In 1972, the light was abandoned and replaced by a buoy. Despite being abandoned and inoperable, captains passing by the lighthouse report seeing it shining. They've even recorded it in their official logs. Our final lighthouse is the Battery Point Lighthouse in Crescent City, California. The Battery Point Light was one of the first lighthouses on the California coast. It was lit in 1856 and automated in 1953. During its existence, the lighthouse went through many keepers. One of them was Captain John Jeffrey, who arrived at the light in 1875 with his wife Nellie. Together they raised a family of 4 and lived at the lighthouse for 39 years. During the lighthouse's history, it managed to make it through the tsunamis caused by the Alaskan earthquake that happened March 27, 1964. A total of 5 tsunamis raced towards the Northern California coast, and the lightkeepers at the time could do nothing more but pray. But luckily, the waves hit at just the right angle, and the lighthouse, the keeper, and his wife were spared. There are some who say it was the Battery Point Light ghosts that saved the lighthouse. The ghosts of the Battery Point Lighthouse are described as a family consisting of a man, woman, and a child. Their footsteps are heard, especially during storms, possibly anxiously watching for another monstrous wave. They have also tapped visitors on the shoulder, and they enjoy sitting in the rocking chairs and rocking. Perhaps it's Jeffrey Wright and his wife and one of their children. Now that's going to do it for this episode. Sorry this one is a little shorter than usual. It's been a stressful couple of weeks. I can't really go into detail, but let me tell you, there are times where I really wonder why I volunteer for so many different things. Then, just as I was getting ready to sit down and type up the episode notes for the episode for this week, ahead of schedule, I might add, I realized that I had left all of my notes, my handwritten research notes and printouts, at my office. And I don't mean the office that is in my house upstairs, I mean my office at work that's 20 minutes away. So in the 11th hour, I had to research and type notes in 2 days. Luckily, I am a world-class procrastinator and work well under pressure. Anyway, you can find Lurk wherever you find your favorite podcast, or at lurkpodcast.com, where we have all of our episodes along with links to our social media accounts. Don't forget to mark your calendar for those 3 upcoming festivals. Also, look for the Lurk Patreon to launch sometime this month. I'm in the process of working on that now. And a big thank you to everyone who voted for Lurk in the Paranormality Magazine Top 10 Paranormal Podcast list. We made the number 5 spot for April. Voting is going on now for May, so if you have a minute, consider voting. You can find the link in the show notes. And if you like what you hear, please tell your friends. And until next time, keep lurking.